Good morning. It's great to worship with all of you today. Some of you know I live in Somerville and am a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Medford. So we are neighbors. As neighbors, we have many things in common and many things to be thankful for together. One of those things is Middlesex Fells, 2,200 acres of forests and lakes that connect Medford and Malden with our neighbors to the north. The fells have not always been forested. In the 17th and 18th centuries, white settlers cut down almost every tree in Massachusetts, some to build houses and ships, some for firewood, and some to ship to plantations in the Caribbean. By the 19th century, it took real imagination to look at bare, rocky pastures and envision public parks full of trees, wildflowers, and hiking trails. The people who had that imagination gave us a wonderful gift. Today, I'd like to tell you some of their stories. Two of the first people to imagine Middlesex Fells were Eliza Wright of Medford and Sylvester Baxter of Malden. If you've hiked a lot in Middlesex Fells, you've probably been to Wright's Tower on the top of Pine Hill, overlooking what was once Eliza Wright's house, but is now I-93. If you haven't seen it directly, you saw it on the screen as you were coming into church. You might also have seen plaques honoring Sylvester Baxter here or there in Malden. When I first moved to Somerville 17 years ago, the memorials to Wright and Baxter caught my attention because I already knew about them through my work as a historian of the religious left. Eliza Wright was one of the abolitionists who founded the Liberty Party in the 1840s because neither of the major parties was willing to take a stand against slavery. Though he'd grown up in Connecticut and Ohio, he came to Boston to edit a newspaper for the Liberty Party. Like many abolitionists, Wright lost his Christian faith as he realized that the Bible was not unambiguously anti-slavery. His new faith was in the power of humanity to build a better world. Soon he became known as America's first atheist. Wright also promoted open conversations about sexuality and the harms of patriarchal marriage. Neither his atheism nor his openness about sex were welcome in Unitarian and Universalist churches in his time. But I suspect he'd be fairly comfortable with our congregations today. Wright's collaborator, Sylvester Baxter, was also a religious nonconformist. In the 1880s, he joined the Theosophical Society, which hoped to unite all the religions and spiritualities of the world. When he read a utopian novel, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, he challenged other theosophists to create intentional communities to put Bellamy's ideas into practice. Baxter also participated in the first archaeological expedition to explore the ancient indigenous cultures of the Southwest. And he edited one of the first magazines to promote bicycle recreation. So if you like riding your bike in the Fells, you have a special debt of gratitude to Sylvester Baxter. Middlesex Fells was just one of the many new things that Wright and Baxter imagined. Their basic idea was simple. The health and happiness of urban dwellers, especially the poor, depends on our access to natural parks where we can breathe fresh air and enjoy beautiful scenery. Centrally located parks, such as Boston Common, were too small to serve the needs of a growing population. But parks located at the ends of streetcar lines could be much larger and still accessible to everyone. And so, Wright and Baxter called for the preservation of the fells, the Blue Hills, the banks of the Charles and Mystic Rivers, and the beaches north and south of Boston. A few years after Wright's death, Baxter served as the founding secretary of the Metropolitan Park Commission, which managed to protect all of those places within just a few years. Wright and Baxter had to imagine many new things to come up with this idea. They had to imagine a future Boston with vastly more people than it had in their day. They had to imagine how streetcars would change the rhythms of city life, making it feasible for city dwellers to visit a park on the edge. They had to imagine that the rockiest, most economically useless parts of town might be treasured for their beauty and ecological diversity. They had to imagine that the city's poor would embrace the idea of a metropolitan park, that they did not want to live in crowded tenements on sunless streets, but had the same desire for outdoor recreation as the wealthy. And they had to imagine that dozens of separate municipalities might work together for the common good. That was an especially tricky imagination because already in the 1880s, wealthy people were concentrating in suburbs like Brookline and Milton so that they wouldn't have to pay for schools in poor cities like Malden. As a proud Maldonian, Baxter was one of the first people to speak out about this problem. If you've been following the debate over the MBTA Communities Act, or attempts to fund all Massachusetts schools equally, you should know that the problem is more than 100 years old, and that the fight started with Sylvester Baxter right here in Malden. Wright and Baxter also had to imagine what might happen if Bostonians failed to act. Would humans even be able to survive if all the forests were cut down? Perhaps, Wright speculated, we would suffocate if the trees stopped absorbing carbon and pumping oxygen back into the air. Wright didn't quite imagine global warming, but he grasped the bigger idea. You can't change one part of an ecosystem without disrupting all the creatures who inhabit it. In many ways, Wright and Baxter imagined us, the people who would inhabit Malden and Medford 150 years later. Would our society still be economically unequal, divided between the rich few and the multitude of the poor? Would our health suffer from ecological imbalances of our own making? Or would we enjoy a forest park as a place of healing open to all? What made it possible for them to imagine all of this? We can think of 19th century America as a time of grand dreams and big imaginings. But Wright was able to imagine Middlesex Fells because his gaze was turned in the opposite direction from that of his fellow citizens. Around the time that Horace Greeley declared, "Go west, young man," Wright moved east from Ohio to Boston. He reversed the migration that his family had taken during his childhood. Wright's return to New England allowed him to rediscover the landscape of his childhood. Middlesex Fells is the part of metropolitan Boston most similar to Wright's hometown in Connecticut. And he was able to instill such love for the place in his children that most of them spent their whole lives nearby. I doubt that Wright would have used this phrase, but I think he was trying to become indigenous to New England. He wasn't playing Indian or appropriating Native American culture, but he was choosing one place, taking the time to really get to know it. He was learning to treat the trees and the animals of Middlesex Fells as relatives, rather than as resources. The campaign for Middlesex Fells coincided with the more famous efforts to save Yellowstone and Yosemite. To my mind, it's a more appealing model of environmental preservation. The creation of national parks did nothing to prevent the genocide of indigenous nations and the ecocide of prairie and buffalo communities. Those catastrophes took place at exactly the same time, and in some cases were perpetrated by people who were also champions of preservation. Elijah Wright did what he could to prevent those catastrophes. He fought to stop dams on the Mississippi River that would have flooded Anishinaabe wild rice fields. He promoted a version of the Homestead Act that would have settled white people more densely, leaving Western lands for their indigenous inhabitants. And back in New England, he set in motion a process of reforestation that actually worked. The reforestation of New England was possible because activists like Wright and Baxter truly knew the lands they hoped to preserve. It was also possible because they were willing to incorporate an element of mourning into their imaginations. We cannot become indigenous to a place unless we are prepared to mourn. And we cannot give thanks for the place where we live unless we are prepared to mourn. That's why it's so fitting that our Thanksgiving Day is now also marked as a national day of mourning, remembering and honoring the ongoing presence of indigenous communities who've had so much taken away from them. To be indigenous is literally to live with the graves of the ancestors, the human ancestors and the animal ancestors, the ancestors of all species. It's to be reminded every day of everything that we have not been able to save. It's not easy for those of us with settler colonial roots. My own ancestors uprooted themselves about every other generation, first leaving Europe behind, then the East Coast, then the Appalachian Mountains. Both my grandfathers left their Midwestern hometowns behind and never looked back. Seeking new opportunities is the American dream, but it's also a way of escaping from the things we have lost and the things we may have destroyed. We have so much to mourn in these days. Half a decade later, we are still mourning those we lost during the pandemic. In the days ahead, other lives will be cut short by increasing medical costs and decreasing funds for medical research. We mourn for our immigrant neighbors who face kidnapping on city streets, and for our trans siblings who face discrimination and harassment. We mourn for the children of Sudan and Congo and Gaza, for those whose homes are sinking into the ocean or burning up with desert sand. We mourn for the million species that are in the process of going extinct, for wolves and frogs and pollinators and all the creatures that depend on them. Elijah Wright and his family chose to spend their time with some of the creatures that were being destroyed in 19th century New England, with the trees. They arrived in Medford at the peak of deforestation. And they made a decision, here on our land, at the base of Pine Hill, we will banish the axe. And we'll try to convince our neighbors to do the same, and to preserve thousands of acres of forested land for the benefit of the whole city and the distant future. The Wrights made this decision because they cherished our UU value of interdependence. Less than 100 years earlier, the Unitarian preacher and scientist Joseph Priestley had discovered oxygen. In the process, he made what Eliezer Wright called the most important scientific discovery of all time: the complementary actions of animal and vegetable life upon the constituents of the atmosphere. Animals breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. Neither can live without the other. Humans and trees are thus the closest of relatives, fully interdependent. This insight gave Wright the imagination to connect trees to every aspect of human life. He saw that the burning of coal made forests more necessary than ever in order to absorb all the newly emitted carbon dioxide. He saw that the diverse towns of the metropolitan area could not preserve the forests they needed unless they worked together. And he saw that the poor needed healthy air and water just as much as the rich. By learning from his relatives, the trees, Eliezer Wright was reimagining the Christian doctrine of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit is that which gives life and makes all things new. But spirit is also just another word for breath or air. Wright recognized that trees are the true temples of the Spirit, the source of that which makes all things new. And he implored his neighbors, instead of building temples and cathedrals, they should devote the same amount of labor to the preservation and production of trees and forests, and thus make the planet better worth living for all. To worship in and with the forest is also to make mourning part of our worship. Trees may be divine in their capacity to breathe new life into the world around them, but they are neither immortal nor omnipotent. The more we realize our dependence on trees, the more we must grieve the annual loss of 10 million hectares of forest land around the world. Here in New England, we enjoy abundant forests thanks to Wright's preservation efforts. But we should not forget all that is being lost in other places. Eliezer Wright did not live long enough to see the success of his campaign for Middlesex Fells. And even if he had, he might have joined his daughter, Ellen, in mourning the ways that the new park managers sometimes betrayed the original vision and perhaps betrayed the trees themselves. The parks valued trees, but not every tree. They didn't see much value in the stump sprouts that typically spring up just after a forest has been logged. They believed that trees sprouted from seeds had more aesthetic value than trunk sprouts. And their policy was to cut down stump-sprouted trees, destroy the stumps, and plant seedlings to take their place. Ellen Wright, who thought that the park managers were a bunch of capitalists who didn't care about people or trees, had a different idea. As her father's daughter, she lived on land that hadn't been logged for 40 years. And so she had a deeper appreciation of the forest's power to heal itself. Over time, she noticed the share of seedling trees gradually increased, even without any intervention to suppress stump sprouting. So her advice was simply to trust the forest, allowing nature to repair itself. Ellen Wright's observation about stump sprouts is an apt metaphor for the relationship between mourning and new imagination. As we mourn everything that we've lost in the past years, we may feel that the forest that once surrounded us has been reduced to stumps. We may be tempted to burn those ugly stumps and plant beautiful new seedlings in their place. We may be tempted, like my settler colonial ancestors, to leave the stumps behind and head west to a place of sweet forgetfulness. But to abandon the stumps, to abandon the past, is to put all the work of healing onto our own shoulders. I hope that we will instead linger with the stumps of these difficult days, letting them bring forth new life. I hope that we will keep telling the stories of the people we've lost. I hope we will linger with the dreams we may have lost long enough to breathe new life into old ways of being together. When we make each stump into a shrine, we'll be there when the new sprouts break through. And we'll discover that we are not alone in the work of healing, but that all the world is healing with us. We cannot save everything that has been or will be destroyed. But we can breathe deeply the air that we cannot create for ourselves, the air that is a free gift from the trees. That air is the Holy Spirit, as old as the forests, and created anew with each breath that we take. So, let us keep on breathing.